Hello, you're watching GB News Originals. I'm Miriam Cates, and I have a very special guest with me today. I've got Tim Dieppe, who's the head of public policy at Christian Concern. Now, Tim has a special interest in Islamic affairs. He's the author of a book called The Challenge of Islam, which discusses the increasing influence of the religion in Britain and how we can respond. Now, Tim, thank you so much for joining me today. How did you first become interested in Islam as a religion?
Well, I think 9/11 was really the catalyst for me, as it was for quite a lot of other people. I think I was working in the city at the time in finance as a fund manager, and we sort of saw the news almost live. Just shortly after it occurred, we saw big screens in our offices, and we saw these planes flying into twin towers, and we knew immediately that this wasn't hijackers, because no pilot would, even with a gun to their head, drive into twin towers like that. And we knew immediately this was likely Islamic inspired terrorism. In fact, friends of mine in the office, I remember saying, I think this is Al Qaeda. And I was like, who's that? Most of us had never heard of this group. And I was like, wow, what is this worldview that can motivate people to do this? I'd heard of suicide bombers before, but I just assumed they must be poor, illiterate, easily manipulable people. And here we had highly trained, well-educated, well-paid, well-motivated people deciding to do this. And I thought, I need to understand, what is this worldview? What is this ideology that can motivate people in this kind of way? And so that really catalyzed me into studying Islam and reading about it and learning about it. And then there's a whole journey. I was asked to run a Sharia fund and all of that, which one can talk about. But that was really what got me set off down this path, if you like.
And sadly, since then, in the last 25 years, we've become increasingly familiar with Islamist terrorism, of course, in this country, focused around Israel particularly. And 2 weeks ago, that horrific attack at Heaton Park Synagogue in Manchester, where an Islamist terrorist attacked and killed a number of Jewish worshippers. He was called Jihad al-Shami. There are some allegations that he got involved in Islamism at his local mosque. What's the connection between Islam, the religion, radical Islam, as we call it in the media, and anti-Semitism, the kind that led to that horrific attack?
Well, yes. I mean, it's very interesting with this chap, Jihad al-Shami, who did this attack very symbolically, of course, on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish year. When he did it, he phoned 999 and said, I've killed some Jews in the name of Islamic State. So the police knew immediately what his motive was, even though we were told in the media they're still trying to work out what his motive was. And Islamic State had called for killings of Jews and Christians just the week before, including by stabbing. So it seems to be partly a response to that. But the whole anti-Semitic thing in Islam is not often talked about. But there's a whole chapter in my book, The Challenge of Islam, which you mentioned, on raising the question, is Islam anti-Semitic? And I argue in this chapter that judged by its texts, and indeed the behavior of Muhammad as well, Islam clearly is and has been through its history highly anti-Semitic. And there are plenty of very strongly anti-Semitic texts in the Quran. I quote them at length in the book, including things like he's sown enmity between us and you till the day of eternity, and things like that aren't just, you can't just say these are contextual things, because they go on like that. I did a debate online last year with a professor, Reza Aslan from the States, on this question, is Islam anti-Semitic? I thought I might as well just do this debate, because all I really have to do is read the text and read quotations from Islamic theologians, and they're very, very clearly anti-Semitic. And of course, you do have the what's called the apocalyptic hadith. The hadith are collections of sayings of Muhammad that are regarded as authoritative by many Muslims, that says, that at the end of time, rocks will cry out, here's a Jew, kill me. And that was actually quoted in the original founding charter of Hamas, and has been shown in surveys to be widely believed. And so, it's not a surprise to me that you see a radical, for the sake of that word, Muslim, targeting Jews, and then, phoning up saying, I've killed some Jews in the name of Islamic State, because that is sadly, part of the teaching can motivate Muslims to go and attack Jews and so on. And then we found that his mosque has been reported for anti-Semitic sermons, in which they've said multiple anti-Semitic things over years. And effectively what they're really doing is just expounding what the Quran says and what the Quran teaches. And that's what the connection that people don't seem to be making. People seem to assume that anti-Semitism in Islam came after the Arab-Israeli conflict or after even the Gaza attack or something like that. Whereas it's not. It's been there right since the beginning, go right back to the Quran and the Hadith and what Muhammad did, and you see very clear anti-Semitism there. And that is, so it's very much rooted in it. So, and this is why I think you saw the Hamas attackers celebrating, phoning up their parents and saying, "Hey, I've killed a Jew. You should be proud of your son." Well, this anti-Semitism is very much at the root of this, sadly.
But not all Muslims interpret the Quran like that, or do they? And there's criticism, of course. People will say, well, in the Bible, in the Old Testament, there's lots of violence, there's lots of battles, there are examples of massacres. Why are we focusing on Islam? There's violence in all religions.
Right, so there's 2 points there. First of all Muslims, and secondly, the Bible. So most Muslims are cultural Muslims, Miriam, and they don't read the Quran. They're not encouraged to read the Quran. Whereas Christians, encourage people to read the Bible, encourage people to ask questions. Muslims are not normally encouraged to read the Quran in a language they understand. They're quite often encouraged to go and learn to recite it in Arabic without actually understanding what it says. And asking questions is discouraged. It's viewed as disrespectful to go and ask your imam, why do we believe this, or why do we think this, and that kind of thing. So most Muslims will be peaceful, peace-loving, cultural Muslims who just like the culture and the people around them are peaceful and loving, and they think therefore Islam is peaceful and loving. That's starting to change because of obviously the internet means that all of this news is very available, and the Quran and the Hadith are very available on the internet and so on. And so many Muslims are actually reading these texts and either radicalizing or actually more often probably, if they're lovely, peaceful people, thinking that is not what I thought this was. I don't want to be part of this anymore. So that's kind of what you're seeing, and many people are leaving Islam, becoming atheists or Christians or something else, partly as a result of what they're seeing, or they read about Islamic State and think, what is this? How do they justify that? And they see that they do justify it from the Quran, and they're like, wow, I never knew the Quran said that, and that's causing something of a crisis in some people in terms of their faith and things. So I think that's the explanation really. But those in the know, those who do read the Quran, those who do take it seriously, will probably end up being radical, unfortunately. And that's how I see it. Now, in terms of the Bible, yes, you have excerpts of violence of different kinds, but no Jew or Christian interprets them as like for all time, like the attacks on the Canaanites. Were a specific time at a specific point in time after 400 years of sin. The Bible says, finally God used Israel to punish them in that way, unusually, extraordinarily, just at that time. No application for today that we should follow that. An application would be a spiritual application, like sin needs to be dealt with and that kind of thing. So that's entirely different. Whereas you have these open-ended verses in the Quran that A, incite violence, and B, incite anti-Semitism. And those are much harder for someone to deal with. And you can watch my debate with Reza Aslan to see how a moderate Muslim who does try and tackle the text deals with it. He just tries to say, "Oh, we're just spiritualized. We don't really interpret." He doesn't actually have a solid argument there if you watch it.
But of course, all this poses a big problem for us here in Britain and in Western Europe more widely, where there has been a lot of Islamic immigration over the recent decades. Because if it's true that Islam is an anti-Semitic religion, and that even if the majority of Muslims don't necessarily know those specific teachings, that is the view of Islamic scholars, and therefore we should be unsurprised about these kind of anti-Semitic attacks. Well, the Muslim population of the UK is growing. There are a lot of Muslim children in this country in schools. How can we prevent radicalization, prevent those kind of interpretations? How can we prevent further horrific attacks if Islam is here to stay in this country?
Well, that's a tough question, isn't it? And it's not easy to deal with, and there's no easy solutions to that. I think we really have to integrate Muslims better. We can't have them separated in particular enclaves in kind of effectively monocultural areas in certain areas of London, in certain areas of Birmingham, certain areas of Bradford, Leicester, and various other places where they're very, very concentrated. And then in Cornwall and Wales, there's very few Muslims and so on. So the concentration means that they then encourage their own culture and form a sort of subculture that is more prone to this kind of radicalization. And you see these people coming from the same kind of areas when they do get involved in extremism. They come from one of those areas very often. And so I think that's an issue. But I think the first step, Miriam, is to recognize that this is what Islam is like. and to tell people and be unafraid to talk about it. What we really can't have is like censoring of what you can say about Islam, which is the real threat with this Islamophobia, planned Islamophobia definition that the government is considering at the moment. But that would really be a problem for us. So first of all, we need to talk about it. We need to explain why Islam is a false religion and be unashamed, unafraid to talk about that and say that. And we need to really monitor, I think, some of these Islamic teachings, some of these Islamic schools and so on. Of course, the government keeps talking about monitoring out-of-school settings, which would include Sunday schools, and all this kind of thing is quite intrusive. But the real target is actually these madrasas, which have been found sometimes to be teaching quite radical stuff. And we are not really equipped for this, because we accept this idea of multiculturalism, that all cultures are equal, all religions are effectively equal, and so on and so on. So for example, if you go to, Ed Hussein wrote a book among the mosques, visited all the major mosques in London, Birmingham, Manchester, Glasgow, etc., found that in the bookstores at those mosques there are freely available books that are banned in Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia is more alert to this than we are. We're just thinking, we believe that all religions are the same and all religions are effectively peaceful, and therefore we're not prepared to tackle it. Well, we need to start by recognizing that's not the case, and then realize we have to tackle it, and that Islam is a special case in this.
And I wonder if we're also holding on to these ideas of core British values being freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of association. The idea of banning books seems inherently un-British. And this is a huge debate at the moment, particularly among the online right, about supposed attacks on our free speech and freedoms by governments trying to crack down, for example, on what's said on social media. We know of some of those cases. But do you think that kind of attitude of these freedoms are fundamentally British is actually making it more difficult for us to tackle Islam and recognise the threats that it poses to our freedom?
Well, I think the problem we have at the moment is that we don't protect freedom of speech enough in relation to Islam. So people are getting arrested and prosecuted and even sentenced for things like burning a book or street preachers. We had a street preacher case here with Christian Concern. John Steele, I think his name was, and he went up to a stand that a Muslim woman was standing behind about domestic abuse, and he said to her, "Have you read these verses in the Quran that would appear to legitimize domestic abuse from Surah 4? You can go and look it up." And they had a friendly discussion. He thought he moved on, then found he'd been reported to the police, and the police went and arrested him for Islamophobia, for questioning what the Quran says. That's crazy. And Hatun Tash, who's a very provocative preacher, has been arrested several times. We've had to sue the police and get her compensation twice of £10,000 a time for that. And so we need to radically say, no, you must be free to say what you think. You must be free to criticize, even mock and ridicule other religions, and Islam in particular, in that, rather than protecting Islam from criticism and seemingly making Christianity and Judaism and others fair game to criticize. So I think that's step one, robustly protecting free speech. And then the other thing is the whole question of two-tier policing, which links into this. We must have the police enforcing equally, regardless of religion, culture, background, whatever, ethnicity, whatever it might be, and not sort of thinking, we might be accused of racism, we go down this. There's a real, undermining of confidence in the police at the moment because of all the examples that people are very aware of apparent two-tier policing. And I think it's been going for many years, and that needs to be resolved by a robust thing. And personally, I think we need to see some police held accountable for not tackling things like grooming gangs when they really should have done.
And why is Islam so protective of its reputation compared to Christianity and Judaism? I mean, I'm a Christian. I don't like it if people, I wouldn't like it if someone burned a Bible or insulted some of the things I believe, but it wouldn't occur to me to do anything about that other than perhaps argue my case. Why is Islam so keen for there to be no criticism, no images of Muhammad? Why do they want this Islamophobia law so much?
Well, I think it's part of the way that Islam works and is founded. They have a very strong sense of what blasphemy is, and that you shouldn't criticize Allah or criticize Muhammad either. And Muhammad himself ordered that people should be killed who criticized him, according to certain traditions in the Hadith and so on. So this is a contrast you can point to. Muhammad, when he was insulted said kill them, whereas Jesus, when he was not only insulted but mocked and beaten and nailed to a cross, said, Father, forgive them. That's a totally different type of religion right there. Muhammad was a warmonger who led and participated in dozens of wars and battles, personally beheaded 600 Jews in a particular circumstance, according to his biography, his official biography that the Muslims revere. Jesus never killed anyone. He healed people. He raised people from the dead. Totally different contrast, totally different kind of religion. And I remember talking to colleagues about this when I worked in the city and saying, do you realize Muhammad was a warlord who killed people? And they were just total, utter disbelief. I thought he was a religious leader. Because we view religions through a lens of a Christian idea of what religion is, which is peaceful and has a peaceful leader and all of that kind of thing, and some other religions too. But Muhammad doesn't fit into that picture, I'm afraid. And we need to explain that and show people that.
Both Christianity and Islam are what we call proselytizing religions. Individual believers believe it's their duty to explain to other people what the religion is about and try to gain converts. But there is a big difference between how government works in apparently Christian countries or countries with a Christian tradition like ours, and what we might call Islamic countries where you essentially have to be a Muslim.
Well, so the big difference really comes down to separation of church and state. So Christianity has a strong doctrine of separation of church and state that comes from the Old Testament, where you had prophets and kings, and they were different, and one would call the others to do the right thing, but the prophets didn't rule the state. And then in the New Testament, you have Jesus saying, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's, indicating a strong sense of separation of church and state there, and that's been a strong thing that Christians have preached and taught, ever since then, really. Whereas Islam doesn't really do that. It doesn't separate church and state or religion and politics in that kind of way, and says no, it actually is a political religion. It has basically assumes that the ideal is to have an Islamic state that is governed by Islamic law and should be operate in that kind of way, and doesn't separate religion and politics in that kind of way. So that's the real difference, and it thinks in terms of territory and political aspirations, whereas Christians tend to think a lot more in terms of spiritual aspirations and growing a spiritual kingdom. Islam thinks a lot more about growing a political kingdom and a contemporary kingdom and that kind of thing. So that's the real big difference there, I think.
So I suppose the question is, can we still maintain this idea of freedom of religion in the UK when some Islamic practices are so antithetical to our understanding of British tradition and British values? I suppose I'm thinking of the kind of laws that were brought in around the time that Protestantism was rising up in this country, and we had to find a way eventually, after some pretty horrific civil wars, of Protestants and Catholics living together, and that's where our ideas about freedom of religion came from. But of course those laws, those understandings were about mitigating between two very similar versions of the same faith, Christianity, whereas Islam is a very, very different religion with very different practices. Are we going to have to choose, do you think, to ban certain practices of Islam in order to keep our other freedoms? Or is there a way of fudging this issue that allows everybody to worship how they want?
Oh no, you absolutely need to ban certain practices of Islam, and freedom of religion has limits, and those limits should be prescribed by law. And polygamy is a good example here. We don't have polygamy in law in this country because we think that's unfair and unjust and wrong for the women, and generally bad for society for lots and lots of reasons. And so, polygamy is outlawed. Now, we have a problem here because many Muslims are having unregistered marriages, so we can come on to talk about that. But, that's an issue where there's a conflict between the religion and the law, and the law is what should stand. And another area would be face coverings and burqas, and 20 countries have banned face coverings and burqas in public places, including France and Belgium and Switzerland and Turkey and some other Islamic countries as well. Because they see the conflicts, between basically dehumanizing women, and also health risks, safety risks, security risks, and just the barrier to communication and the severe sort of cultural "I'm different" thing, that message that sends. So I think we could do that as well, and it has been done, and we could do that kind of thing as well. And I think yes, certain practices and certain teachings should be banned, whilst allowing freedom of religion in terms of, yes, you can still worship at a mosque and pray to Allah and all of these kind of things.
And are there any other Western countries where they have managed this better than the UK, where they've been able to come to a position where you're free to be Muslim, but essentially the Western Christian-based culture has dominance, is allowed to continue?
To be honest, I don't know a good example.
Okay.
There's an issue here. There's an issue here that where Islam grows and is allowed to grow, it gets stronger and stronger. And ultimately, what we are seeing in other European countries is a much stronger clampdown on immigration, because people are like, we don't want this anymore. We can't have this anymore. We need to stop it. And so there are massive clampdowns, in some cases deportations, and that's the effect. And that's the sort of strong arm policy that I think ultimately countries will have to resort to, or will be pressured to resort to, in order to resolve this real tension. And obviously, we saw the United Kingdom march here in London, whenever it was, last month or something, which just shows the underlying tensions around this whole issue that people feel. And people were accused of co-opting Christianity by carrying crosses and all that kind of thing. But I think they're harking back for Christianity was good for us. Why can't we have that again? Why do we have to see all of these Islamic things and Palestinian flags all over the place and so on, and halal meat, and then there's the whole grooming gang thing and all of that kind of thing that's under the surface here, and it's serious. And I don't see a country that's done it very well up to now.
And of course, we do need to talk about these things. We can't be afraid of talking about Islam. But are you also concerned that the fears of ordinary Muslims about anti-Muslim hatred, about potentially protests and marches like that escalating into violence? I mean, they haven't yet, but do you think those fears are well founded? Do you think we need to be careful how we talk about this, or should we just be bold and try to get to the truth?
I think there's a massive difference between the pro-Palestinian protests that you've seen, which have had, was it 500 arrests at one of the recent ones?
Yeah.
Huge breakouts of violence and criminality, and also chanting, violently anti-Semitic chants and so on, openly in front of the police and so on, and people being very intimidated and very scared by them. Contrasts actually with the United Kingdom march, where I think there was 23 arrests, and I gather that most of them were actually from counter-protesters. The level of difference there is absolutely massive. Of course, I don't want Muslims to be the target of abuse at all, let alone violence or anything like that. And that should be prosecuted, as it should be for anybody who incites violence in any way, or abuses or threatens people in any way, that kind of thing. Yes, I'd want to do that. But what we haven't seen enough of is really prosecutions and tackling of the anti-Semitic hatred and threats that have been going on. But I was encouraged to see this Oxford student, being suspended and then arrested for saying, "Put those Zions in the ground," which is basically an incitement to violence, in my opinion.
Tim Dieppe, absolutely fascinating to talk to you. And I think one thing is clear: we should all learn a lot more about Islam, what the religion teaches, and start thinking about how we can mitigate some of these problems. Tim Dieppe, thank you so much for your time.